ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, this is The Leader, and I'm Mark Blunden. The United Kingdom woke on Friday to absorb the news of the death of Queen Elizabeth II after the 96-year-old monarch died peacefully at Balmoral.
This is a person that lived an amazingly full life. You know, her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. She's travelled the world. I was outside the palace till very late, actually, and a lot of people had come just to have a few quiet moments there.
That was our royal editor Robert Jobson talking to us this morning close to the palace. Mourners from around the world in their thousands are gathering at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle and Sandringham House in an outpouring of public emotion.
We've been coming here for years. Phoenix, who did we come to lay flowers for? For the Queen.
As all the media people have said, she was sort of glue that held people together, and I just thought she was a very strong, devoted sovereign.
In a sort of sad way, in a time when a lot of us are sort of divided in a lot of different ways, it has brought our country together.
I'm a coronation baby.
Oh yes, he was born in 53, so she's been on the throne as long as you've been born.
Yeah.
Church bells rang out across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, like this one in Cardiff. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery led a death gun salute from Hyde Park, with cannon from all four corners of the UK firing a total of 96 rounds in tribute.
She really was Elizabeth the Great. You know, this is a great monarch, her longest living, oldest monarch in history, and I think we will look back in the years to come at this golden Elizabethan age, an age where she really did shine as a monarch, but somebody who reigned over so many changes in society, not only in this country but in the realms and the Commonwealth, and had an influence all around the world, and very much was the Queen of the world.
The nation is due to be addressed by the new head of state, King Charles III. The King and Camilla, who is now Queen Consort, stayed at Balmoral on Thursday night before returning to Buckingham Palace on Friday when they were greeted by the crowds. Charles also met the new Prime Minister Liz Truss for the first time since his mother's death. It comes as members of Parliament paid tribute to Queen Elizabeth II in an all-day sitting at the House of Commons. A period of national mourning, likely to be up to 13 days, is due to be confirmed by the government ahead of the Queen's funeral, with preparations being made under a protocol codenamed Operation London Bridge. Now we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Spangler, a senior lecturer in history at Manchester Metropolitan University. Dr. Spangler, what's your view on the significance of this moment in modern British history?
Certainly this is a moment that people have been anticipating for half a century, really, as to the transition was successfully made, I suppose you could say, into the modern era, when many monarchies across Europe fell and the British monarchy continued after the Second World War. So the question was then going to be what followed, I think, the reign of Elizabeth II. And of course, that remains to be seen, really. But the transition so far has been, as tradition dictates, instantaneous and smooth.
Could you give us some context about the royal family's connections to Europe?
Yeah, the connections to Europe, I think, are really fascinating and certainly worth more scrutiny. One of the great things that characterized the British monarchy in the 19th century was its position as really the head or the apex of this vast European dynastic system that had been established over several centuries, and Queen Victoria was the supreme architect of this great dynastic system. There was a strong belief that blood and kinship would be enough to hold together European powers and stop them from going to war. But as we saw with World War I and World War II, it wasn't, and that idea faded. So the post-war monarchies are much less close than they once were, and the British monarchy has moved away in some ways. So if you look at the Danes or the Norwegians or the Swedes, they're still very quite tightly connected by blood and relationship, whereas the English have moved off slightly.
And are there any historical parallels after the deaths of previous monarchs?
I think it's a very interesting time of history now that we live in what some people might even call the post-media era, where it's almost a free-for-all for everyone. In previous centuries, the private lives of monarchs and monarchies were just that, very private. Since the beginning of, say, Victoria's reign, and then certainly in the 20th century, we've seen quite a lot more public exposure of monarchs. And when a monarch then dies, there's quite a significant amount of mourning and certainly a lot of ceremonial that goes around a funeral, preparations for another coronation. So we saw it with Victoria. We saw it certainly with George V and George VI. I think Edward VII, unfortunately, got a bit of a bum deal because he was on the throne for such a short time.
What do you make of the outpouring of emotion, particularly from younger people, and how do you think the Queen will be remembered, even by those who are not particularly royalists?
It's been my experience as a foreigner, I was born and raised in the United States, that it's interesting that even though there are quite a lot of people here who are fundamentally Republicans, nevertheless, I think it's fairly universal that everyone admires the work that's been done by Elizabeth II, and the sheer tenacity and the dedication to work values that Elizabeth II has shown. And so I think that kind of answers almost the first question, really, is that younger people have grown up in this world where it's just assumed that the Queen is a constant in your life, and now suddenly that isn't true. So so I think it actually caught a lot of people off guard who weren't really expecting to be feeling quite so strong by this event.
Are there any specific moments in your view that defined Queen Elizabeth's reign?
So certainly if people focus on the very first few years, I know that there was a lot of emphasis put on this idea of a great cultural renaissance, a second Elizabethan era that was going to attempt to put Britain back at the forefront of world culture in the 1950s. And it just didn't really take off the way people had hoped because of austerity and a number of social and political problems that followed. But the fact, I think, that the Queen was steadfast through it really was then to her credit. The other then big milestone would be the 1960s, lots and lots of social changes. And again, the royal family felt like they needed to maintain their role, which is to be traditional, and yet they wanted to show themselves as being a bit different. And so they had the documentary that showed them at Balmoral as being just a family. But then I suppose the major moments are then getting through the economic crisis of the 1970s and then her own dynastic crises of the 1990s. So there has been quite a lot of these events. The end of the Cold War, you could say, was certainly a major part of the reign. And in a global sense, you might say that the role the Commonwealth played in that. And the Commonwealth is pretty central, I think, to the Queen's identity.
Who are the key people involved in the accession arrangements, and has it always been the same through history?
There's been a very long tradition in terms of the ceremonial and the history of monarchy, of how the court reacts, how the court goes into mourning, who organizes funerals. And for a long, long time, since the 16th century at least, that's been the purview of the Earl Marshal. And many court offices, in fact, most court offices are not hereditary. But the Earl Marshal has been hereditary for several hundred years. And the Duke of Norfolk has always been the Earl Marshal. And so it's his job to step in now and really plan the funeral and the coronation that will then follow.
Now we're joined by Sarah Richardson, Professor of British History at the University of Warwick. What do you think is the significance of this moment for Britain's constitutional monarchy?
So I think that any change of monarch is a moment of anxiety for the country, and it tends to set a tone and change things. The monarchy, in a way, is all about continuity, but it does also encompass some change. So I think that this is a transformational moment in British history. Most of the population have grown up with the Queen and cannot remember a previous monarch. There are certain challenges. There have been constitutional changes in the past few years, for example, allowing the eldest child, if they're a boy or a girl, to inherit the throne. Those might seem sort of minor things, but they're quite seismic in terms of the monarchy. There are also changes overseas. So in the Commonwealth, there are discussions in places like Australia about whether the Queen should be head of state. We've also seen discussions in the Caribbean about moving away from the Queen as head of state. So I think that all of these things mean that the change in monarch at this particular moment will be momentous for British politics, society, and the wider world.
What will be the role of the wider royal family in this period of mourning?
So I think that during this period of mourning, most of the focus will be on Charles. Tomorrow, for example, there'll be the proclamation of his accession, which is the sort of formal transfer where sort of leading political figures swear allegiance to the new monarch. And that's a really important moment in the transfer from one monarch to another, although he became king as soon as the Queen died. In the past, you will sort of realise that swearing allegiance to a new monarch is quite important, because it wasn't always the case that they would be that popular. In terms of the protocols around the funeral itself and this period of mourning, I think the roles for the wider royal family, particularly the sort of senior royals, if I can put it like that, will be to be a presence, to be visible, to reach out, if you like, to the public. They don't particularly have a formal role, but I expect, for example, they will go to church services. It's expected that there'll be a service at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, and also one at Westminster Hall when the Queen's body is moved down to London and to Westminster Hall, where she'll lie in state. It may be that certainly the male members with their military affiliations stand guard. That's certainly happened in the past. There isn't sort of a formal protocol rule, but I think that it's really important that the wider royal family is visible. And I wonder, even with Princess Anne, she took quite a sort of leading role in the funeral of her father, in terms of, she sort of led the procession behind the coffin with Charles, and I wonder if she'll do something similar with her mother.
Are there any specific moments in your view that defined Queen Elizabeth's reign?
So I think that there are so many. I mean, you look back over the last 70 years and it's really difficult to choose, defining moments. But I think if you're thinking about the monarchy as an institution itself, then things like the public broadcast she gave, even during the war before she was queen, on the radio, and then obviously the Christmas messages via radio and then television. I think that's the monarchy moving into a new age, of sort of a new media age. More broadly, I think things like the establishment of the Commonwealth has been important. The rapid decolonisation after the end of the Second World War certainly changed Britain's relationship with the wider world, and the Commonwealth has been quite important as a way of keeping those links in a different format. And so I think the establishment of the Commonwealth is definitely important. Things like space travel and the rise of technology, no personal computers in 1953. Now we have devices all over the place. Education, certainly the rise of higher education, the role of women has changed dramatically. Certainly in the 1950s, there was still a marriage bar. So if you got married, you had to give up your job in many of the both private occupations, but also public ones like the teaching and the civil service, to a position now where there's equal pay. We have had 3 female prime ministers, and it's far from maybe gender equality, but it's certainly moved a long way from the 1950s.
What are your thoughts on how King Charles's style and priorities could differ from Queen Elizabeth?
So I think that Charles will be a different type of monarch. I think we've seen in the year or so since Prince Philip died that he has been active in sort of slimming down the monarchy, and I think that will continue. I'm unsure, I guess, about how he will behave in terms of things that are very, very dear to him, like the environment, like climate change, and whether he will continue to take a sort of active positional role, or whether he will be content with being the symbolic head of state. So it's going to be a very interesting time. The other big challenge, of course, is with Commonwealth countries and changes in relationships with the monarch as head of state. And I think that may need a new form of sort of relationship between the monarchy and Commonwealth countries.
What's your view on the fact that a male monarch is exceeding a female monarch? And do you think this was of importance to the way the nation and the world perceived our royalty?
So I think having a female monarch, and certainly one that was so active and so sort of pioneering, for example, joining the armed services when she was a young girl during the war, she was a sort of role model. The accession of a monarch is always one of anxiety. So there's always worries about changes of style. And certainly having young female monarchs like Elizabeth, like Victoria, there seemed to be more anxiety. So it will be interesting to see we have an older male monarch. It's a different sort of worry. The concern is Charles too set in his ways? Has he had the latitude to, some would say, interfere, or at least have opinions on things that monarchs shouldn't really do? Because there's this very fine line with their constitutional position, which is incredibly important, and their sort of opinions and political views, which they can't be seen to have. They cannot be seen to be on one side or another. So I think those will be the sorts of anxieties, less about his gender and more about his age and his experience and his past history.
There's more on this story in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk.